I built a world where a man could own something. I put the automobile in the hands of the working family. I paid wages high enough that a man who built things with his hands could also buy things with them. I cut the working day to 8 hours so that a man had time to tend his own land, build his own garden, teach his own children something useful. I believed, with complete sincerity, that what I was building was the foundation of a genuinely free society. A society where ordinary men owned their tools, owned their homes, made things with their hands, and owed nothing to anyone they did not choose to owe. And then I watched something happen that I did not build and did not intend. I watched the prosperity I had created get redirected, quietly and systematically, into a machine that converted free men into men who owed money every month for the rest of their lives for things that were supposed to make them free. I watched the dream I built get sold back to the people I built it for, on installment payments. What I am going to describe in this message is exactly how that happened, why it was permitted to happen, and what the specific difference is between the life I was trying to build toward and the life that most people ended up living instead. Stay with me, because the distinction is not historical. It is present in every financial decision you are making today. I am Henry Ford. I built the Ford Motor Company. I put the Model T on the road at a price that working families could save toward. I built the assembly line, which created the productivity that funded higher wages, which created the purchasing power that built the American middle class. I believed in the working man's ability to own things outright, to build financial stability through production and saving rather than through borrowing, and to pass something real to his children rather than a set of monthly obligations. I will say directly that not everything I did was right. The company made decisions I regret. I held views that I should have examined more carefully. And the world I helped to build contained contradictions I did not fully resolve in my lifetime. I am not presenting myself as a perfect example of anything. What I am presenting is a specific observation about the difference between building wealth and building the appearance of wealth, between owning and owing, between self-reliance and dependency that has been packaged and sold as freedom. Because that distinction, which was already being blurred in my lifetime, has become the central economic reality of most people's lives. And the people living inside it often do not have a clear language for describing what is happening to them. By the end of this message, you will understand the specific mechanism by which the dream of ownership was replaced by the reality of ongoing obligation. You will understand why that replacement was not accidental. And you will have specific, practical things to change about how you handle your own money and your own time that move you from the obligation side of that line toward the ownership side. Listen to this every day. The man who hears it once sees something. The man who hears it 30 times starts making different choices. Before I describe what went wrong, I need to be precise about what I was trying to build, because the popular version of the story is much simpler than the actual intention. When I introduced the Model T in 1908, the automobile was a luxury item. The men who owned one were wealthy men. The design and pricing decisions I made for the Model T were specifically aimed at changing that. A simple design, a single color, black, because it was most durable and cheapest to produce. A price that, while it required real saving for a working family, was within the range of genuine possibility rather than a theoretical aspiration. But the Model T was not, as sold in 1908, something a working man could put on credit. The approach I expected working families to take was to save for it, to buy it when they had the money for it. This was not simply a matter of how the company structured its sales. It was a reflection of a specific belief about what financial health looked like for ordinary families. I believed, and I believe now, that a man who owns a thing outright is in a fundamentally different position than a man who makes payments on a thing. The outright owner can stop using the thing without consequence. He can sell it. He can give it away. He can make decisions about it that are entirely his own because no other party has a claim on it. The man who owes on a thing must keep making the payments. He must continue earning at a level that supports the payment. He must manage his circumstances to protect the payment arrangement, or he loses not just the money he has already put in, but often the thing itself. The obligation is not neutral. It constrains the man who carries it in ways he does not always consciously register. The $5 workday was designed, among other things, to make this kind of outright ownership possible for working families. If a man earned enough to cover his genuine needs and still save a meaningful amount each month, he could accumulate the price of a Model T without taking on debt. He could own something real without owing anything for it. And from that foundation of real ownership, he could build. This was the dream I was building toward. Not the automobile specifically, the principle it represented. A working man who could own things outright, who could build financial stability through earning and saving rather than borrowing, who had enough margin in his monthly income to make choices about his financial future rather than simply managing obligations he had already taken on. The Ford Motor Company introduced installment buying for its vehicles in the early 1920s. I resisted this for longer than anyone else in the industry. General Motors had been offering installment plans aggressively, and the sales numbers made it difficult to argue against. Men who could not save the full price of a car could drive one home the same week they decided they wanted it, as long as they could manage the monthly payment. The numbers were impossible to ignore. The installment plan sold more cars. More cars sold meant more production, more workers employed, more revenue for the company. The short-term argument for the installment plan was genuinely strong. What I saw in it that made me resist it, and that I eventually failed to resist sufficiently, was a specific change in the relationship between the buyer and the thing he was buying. When a man saved for his Ford and bought it with money he had earned and kept, the car was his. Completely. The relationship was clean. When a man took on an installment plan to buy his Ford, he drove something home that had his name on the papers, but that he did not yet own. He owned the obligation to pay for it. The car itself belonged, in practical terms, to the arrangement until the last payment was made. This is a very small distinction when you state it about one vehicle. It becomes a different kind of distinction when you state it about a household. A household in which the furniture, the automobile, the household appliances, and eventually the house itself are all being paid for on installment, is a household whose ongoing financial health depends entirely on maintaining a consistent level of income to service the obligations. Any disruption, any illness, any loss of employment, any event that reduces the income stream threatens not just the comfort of the household, but the very objects that constitute it. The household is fragile in a specific way that a household built on owned assets is not. I watched this happen at scale, across the country, in the years of the 1920s, and the consequences of it arrived in 1929 with a force that should not have surprised anyone who had been paying attention. A society in which most households were carrying significant installment obligations, in which the prosperity was built on the obligation to continue servicing debt rather than on the accumulation of owned assets, was not resilient. When the income stream was interrupted, the obligations remained, and the obligations stripped households of the things they had been paying for, leaving them in a worse position than if the purchases had never been made at all. What I described in that last section is visible in hindsight. The mechanism by which it happened, the specific way that debt was made to look like freedom to the people taking it on, is what I want to describe now. Because the mechanism is still running and still producing the same results, and most people inside it have never had it described to them as a mechanism. The mechanism has two parts. The first part is the reframing of ownership. The second part is the reframing of obligation. The reframing of ownership works like this. The thing you are making payments on is described throughout the transaction and afterward as yours, your car, your house, your furniture. The possessive is applied immediately and consistently, even though the legal reality is that you have a claim on the thing that is conditional on completing a series of payments that may extend for years. The language of ownership is applied in advance of the economic reality of ownership, and because the language is applied immediately, the psychological reality of ownership arrives immediately too. You feel that you own the thing. You have the experience of ownership. The practical limitations of the conditional ownership are invisible in the daily experience of using the thing. The reframing of obligation works like the first part in reverse. The monthly payment, which is the monthly cost of the obligation you have taken on, is described not as a debt, but as an investment in your life, in your family, in the quality of your experience. Paying for a house on installment is not called debt management. It is called building equity. Paying for a car on installment is not called managing a liability. It is called transportation. The obligation is embedded in a frame of benefits so thoroughly that the burden of it becomes nearly invisible, even as it shapes every financial decision you make for the duration of the payment period. Together, these two reframings produce a specific psychological state that I think is the most accurate description of where most ordinary people in a debt-dependent economy actually live. They feel like owners. They have the experience of ownership, but their financial behavior is constrained exactly the way debtors are constrained, not the way owners are. They cannot stop making the payment. They cannot easily change direction. They are committed to a level of income sufficient to service the obligations, and if that income changes, the things they have been told are theirs are revealed not to have been theirs at all. This is what I mean when I say the dream was sold back to the people I built it for. Not through deception exactly. Through a consistent, systematic application of language and framing that made the experience of obligation indistinguishable in the daily life of the person carrying it from the experience of ownership, until the moment the income stopped. And then the difference became unmistakable. There was a man in Detroit in the years when I was building the company, not one of my workers, but a tradesman in the city, a carpenter named Daniel, who had worked in the building trades since he was a young man. Daniel had built a specific financial practice that was unusual enough in his circle that people noticed it, and that I came to know about through a conversation with someone who knew him. Daniel's practice was this. He owned his tools outright, not on a payment plan. Bought when he had saved the money for them. He owned his house outright. Bought in pieces, adding rooms as he could afford them, finishing it section by section over several years, rather than borrowing to build it complete, and paying for the privilege of living in it complete from the first day. He owned the wagon he used for his work. He owed no one ongoing payment obligations beyond his regular household expenses. What this practice produced, by the time I heard about him, was a specific quality of financial stability that his neighbors and colleagues, most of whom had financed more of their circumstances, did not have. When the building trade slowed, as it periodically did, Daniel's household expenses did not change. He had no payment obligations that required a consistent income level to sustain. He could take less work, work for lower rates if necessary, manage a period of reduced income without any of his circumstances being threatened. His tools were his house was his wagon was his. The income could flex because the obligations were minimal. What struck me about Daniel's story was not that his approach was unusual in any complicated sense. It was that it was unusual at all. What he was doing was simple and old, and had been the standard practice of financially stable households for generations before installment. Credit made it possible to acquire things you had not yet paid for. He was simply not participating in the substitution of obligation for ownership that the credit system had made so available and so normal. His children, the story went, grew up in a household where there was always enough because the ongoing obligations were small. They did not inherit wealth in a dramatic sense, but they inherited a paid-for house and tools and a practice of building before spending that constituted a real and useful inheritance, not the borrowed appearance of prosperity, the actual thing. I have thought about Daniel many times since I heard that story, not because his approach was complex or required extraordinary discipline, because the contrast between what his life actually was and what most people in similar circumstances had accepted as the normal arrangement of financial life was stark. The normal arrangement had been redesigned, by the time he was living it, to produce the appearance of prosperity through obligation rather than the actual thing through patient accumulation. And most people could not see the difference from inside it because the language and the framing had been applied so consistently that the two things looked and felt identical until the income stopped. I want to spend time on this because the concept of self-reliance has been reduced in common usage today to something like a personality type or a political stance. A person is described as self-reliant if they do not like asking for help or if they have a certain independence of spirit. This is not what I mean, and it is not what the concept was built to describe. Self-reliance, as a practical economic concept, means that your daily life and your household stability do not depend on a continuous flow of income at a specific level in order to maintain the conditions you are living in. It means that if your income dropped by 30% tomorrow, you would lose comfort and convenience, but not the fundamental structure of your household. You would not lose your home. You would not lose your tools. You would not lose the basic assets from which any recovery is possible. Most people today are not self-reliant in this sense, regardless of their income. A household carrying mortgage payments, car payments, and regular consumer debt obligations at a level calibrated to a specific income is a household whose stability depends entirely on maintaining that income. A drop in income of 30% does not produce a 30% reduction in comfort. It produces a crisis because the obligations are fixed and the income is not. The building of genuine self-reliance is not about earning more. It is about reducing the ratio of fixed obligations to income. The man who earns $50,000 in a year and owns his home outright and his tools outright and carries no ongoing payment obligations has more genuine financial freedom than the man who earns $200,000 in a year and carries obligations that consume $170,000 of it. The first man can survive a period of lower income without losing the foundation of his life. The second man cannot afford a 6-month gap in his income even though his annual earnings are 4 times as large. This is the specific thing that I was trying to build when I built toward higher wages and lower prices on real goods, not the ability to consume more, the ability to own more, to accumulate outright ownership of things that persist and that provide a foundation for resilience rather than a monthly claim on future income. I want to close the development section of this message with the most important thing I know about the difference between the dream and the financed version of the dream, which is what happens to both over 20 years. The household that finances its prosperity, that carries ongoing payment obligations for its house, its vehicles, its appliances, its furniture, and its consumables, accumulates the appearance of prosperity in year 1. By year 5, it has more things than the household that is building slowly toward owned assets. By year 10, the financed household and the patient household look roughly similar in their daily lives. By year 20, the patient household owns its position. The financed household is still making payments or has already lost things to the inability to make payments. This is the compound that is invisible during the years it is building. The patient household does not look like it is winning during those 20 years. The financed household looks more prosperous at almost every visible point in the process. The nice car, the bigger house, the new appliances, all of it looks like winning. And then the income changes, as it inevitably does for most people at some point over a 20-year period, and the structure of the two households is revealed. The structure of the patient household is made of things it owns. The income can flex without the structure threatening to collapse, because the structure does not depend on the income to remain intact. The structure of the financed household is made of things it owes on. The income cannot flex without threatening the structure because every element of the structure requires the payment to continue. This is the 20-year picture of the dream versus the financed version. Most people make the financial decisions of their 20s and 30s based on the 1-year picture, which favors the financed version, rather than the 20-year picture, which favors the patient version. And the 20-year picture is the one that determines where you actually end up. The one practice that produces the 20-year picture you actually want is the habit I described. Consistent, purposeful saving towards specific owned assets, applied before expanding consumption, applied before adding new payment obligations, applied every time income arrives, for as long as it takes to build the foundation that the patient version of the dream requires. It takes longer, it feels less impressive during the years you are doing it, and it produces a kind of freedom at the end of it that the financed version cannot produce at any point in the process. Here is the first exercise. It takes about 30 minutes, and reveals something that most people have never looked at directly. Write a list of everything that constitutes your daily life: your housing, your transportation, every tool or piece of equipment you use regularly, every subscription or ongoing service, every payment you make monthly. Now mark each item with one of three designations: O for outright owned, no ongoing obligation, the thing is yours free and clear; P for payments in progress, you have a claim on it but you are still making payments; and R for renting or subscribing, you have temporary access to it contingent on continued payment but no accumulating ownership claim at all. Count the three categories. What percentage of the things that constitute your daily life do you outright own? What percentage are you making payments toward owning? What percentage are you renting without accumulating any ownership? Then ask the specific question: if my income dropped by 30% tomorrow, which of these items would be threatened? Make a specific list of the items that would require you to maintain your current income level or lose them. What you are looking at is your financial resilience profile. The higher the percentage of outright owned items and the lower the payment obligations relative to your income, the more resilient your position. The higher the payment obligations relative to your income, the more dependent your entire current life is on maintaining a specific income level indefinitely. This is not a judgment. It is a measurement. You cannot change a situation you have not first measured accurately. The ownership inventory gives you the accurate picture of where the dependency actually sits in your specific financial life. Then you can make deliberate choices about what to address first. I am going to tell you something that I did not say clearly enough while I had the platform to say it, and that I believe if I had said it more directly in the years of my greatest influence, might have changed something about how the dream I was building got redirected. The productivity I created with the assembly line and the $5 day was genuine. The rise in real wages was genuine. The expansion of what ordinary working people could afford to own was genuine. What I did not say clearly enough was that the way to use that new prosperity was to own things rather than to finance them. That the right response to having more money than your parents had was to use it to build a foundation of owned assets rather than to expand your level of ongoing obligation. This sounds obvious when I say it now. It was not obvious in a culture that was simultaneously being told, through every available channel of commercial communication, that the right way to use rising income was to consume rising amounts of goods. That prosperity meant the ability to have the new thing now, not the discipline to save and buy the new thing outright. The commercial message and my message were incompatible, and the commercial message was louder and more constant and more immediately rewarding to receive because it told people what they wanted to hear. You deserve this now. You can have this now. The payment is easy. The thing itself is yours. My message required something uncomfortable. It required the patience to not have the thing until you had the money for the thing. It required the specific discipline of making a distinction between what you could afford today in terms of monthly obligation and what you could afford today in terms of total cost. These are very different numbers, and the gap between them is the space where financial fragility grows. I was building higher wages and I was building lower prices on real goods. I should have been building, with equal energy, a cultural message about what to do with the difference. Not consume more on credit. Save more. Own more. Build a foundation that resilience can stand on rather than a structure that requires constant income maintenance to remain standing. I did not do this adequately, and the dream I was trying to build was, in the absence of that message, gradually converted by commercial forces into something that looked like the dream from the outside and that felt like the dream in the daily experience of the people living it, but that was structurally the opposite. Not ownership and independence. Obligation and dependency, packaged and sold in the language of prosperity and freedom. Here is the way I have explained this to people when I have wanted to make the distinction between owning and owing as clear as possible. A man who owns a horse can go wherever he wants, whenever he wants, at a pace he determines, and stop when he decides. He maintains the horse, feeds it, cares for it, but the relationship is his. The horse is his. He has decisions to make about the horse that no one else can make for him. A man who rents a horse can also go many places. He can travel, He can work, he can accomplish things that a man without a horse cannot, but the relationship is not his. The route, the timing, the pace, all of these are constrained by the terms of the rental. He must return the horse, he must not damage it, he must pay for it at the agreed intervals or lose access to it. His freedom of movement exists only while the rental terms are being met. The owned horse and the rented horse look identical while everything is going well. Both can pull a wagon. Both can carry a man across town. The difference appears only when something changes. When the man with the owned horse faces difficulty, he has the horse. He can work with it, or sell it, or let it rest while he recovers, because the horse is his, and no one can take it from him for decisions he has not made. When the man with the rented horse faces difficulty, the first thing that happens is that the rental becomes unaffordable and the horse is gone. His means of recovery disappears at exactly the moment he most needs it. The dream of prosperity I was building was a dream of owned horses, multiplied. The dream that was sold in its place, the dream of monthly payments on everything from the house to the furniture to the vehicle, was a dream of rented horses that felt indistinguishable from owned ones right up until the moment the income stopped. Own your horses. That is the practical summary of everything in this section. Own the tools, own the vehicle, own the house if at all possible. Build toward outright ownership, even if the path is slower and requires more patience than the financing alternative. The patience has a specific reward that the impatience cannot provide. There is something I need to say here that is honest in a way that most public figures are not honest about the things they helped to create. I helped build the conditions that made the large-scale financialization of ordinary life possible, not directly, not through the installment plans I eventually reluctantly permitted on Ford vehicles, but through something more structural. The assembly line increased productivity so dramatically that the cost of making goods fell rapidly. Falling costs of production, combined with rising wages, created a gap that had not previously existed in working-class life: discretionary income, money beyond what was immediately needed for survival. That gap was what made the credit culture possible. There was nothing to sell on credit to a man who had nothing left over after feeding his family. The gap I helped create gave commercial forces something to work with. I believed the gap would be used for saving and building. I believed the rise in purchasing power would produce a rise in outright ownership. I thought that the men who had never before had margin in their household budgets would, having received it, do what I would have done: accumulate, build, own things, create resilience. What I underestimated was the power of the commercial apparatus that was simultaneously developing alongside the rising income. An apparatus that understood the gap I had created and that worked to fill it before any of it could be saved or owned, not through force. Through the specific persuasion that I described earlier, the reframing of obligation as ownership, the reframing of the payment as the thing itself. I am not absolved of responsibility for not seeing this clearly enough, while I had the influence to say something about it that might have mattered. The workers I paid $5 a day were free to do whatever they wanted with the income. I had no right and no desire to control their spending. But I could have spoken more clearly, more publicly, and more consistently about the difference between using the new prosperity to build owned assets and using it to service ongoing obligations. I did not do this with the urgency and the clarity that the situation eventually warranted. This is the specific regret that this script is built around, not the prosperity I created. The prosperity was genuine and real, and I believe it was good. The regret is the dream that the prosperity was supposed to produce, and that the prosperity was redirected into something that looked like the dream from the outside and was not, from the inside, the thing I had intended. I have described the problem at length because understanding it clearly is necessary before the alternative can be applied meaningfully. Now, I want to describe the alternative in specific, practical terms that are available to the person listening to this today. The alternative to the debt-financed appearance of prosperity is building the actual thing more slowly. That is the honest description of it. It is slower. It requires more patience than the financed version. and it produces a fundamentally different quality of stability at the end. Here is what it looks like in practice. You separate your basic needs from your aspirations, and you fund the basic needs from current income, while you build toward the aspirations from savings. You do not finance the aspiration because you want it now. You fund it when you have saved the actual price of it. This is not complicated. It is merely slower than the alternative, and slower is uncomfortable in a culture that has been telling you since you were old enough to hear it that you can have it now. You identify the one most valuable asset in your current financial life, the one whose paid-off ownership would most reduce your monthly obligation load, and you accelerate payment on it before you expand your consumption in any other direction. Paying off the most significant obligation is more valuable in most cases than any other use of surplus income, because the obligation eliminated does not simply save the payment amount. It eliminates the vulnerability attached to that payment amount permanently. You distinguish between tools and luxuries, and you prioritize owning tools outright before financing luxuries. A tool is something that enables you to produce income or to reduce expenses. A luxury is something that produces comfort or status. Tools owned outright strengthen your position. Financed luxuries weaken it. This distinction, applied consistently, changes the composition of what you accumulate over time in a way that compounding favors. These three practices are not new. They are not complicated. They are old and simple, and they work. They produce real ownership more slowly than the alternative. But the real ownership they produce is actually real. The rented horse of financed prosperity disappears when the payment stops. The owned horse of patient accumulation stays. Here is the second exercise. It is action-oriented and produces something concrete within 30 days. Using the ownership inventory from the first exercise, identify the single monthly obligation that, if eliminated, would most reduce your financial vulnerability. Not necessarily the largest in dollar amount. The most vulnerability reducing. Often this is the one that, if the payment stopped, would most directly threaten the basic structure of your daily life. Write down the total remaining amount owed on this obligation. Write down your current monthly payment. Write down the number of months remaining at the current payment rate. Now write down 3 specific ways you could increase the payment on this specific obligation from existing income by reducing something else. Not abstract reductions, specific ones. The meal out that does not happen this month, the subscription that is paused, the discretionary category that is reduced. 3 specific things that together produce a meaningful additional amount that goes entirely to accelerating the payment on this single obligation. Apply those 3 changes for 90 days, with all the freed amount going to the target obligation. At the end of 90 days, measure the change in the remaining balance and the reduction in the expected payoff date. You are doing 2 things simultaneously with this exercise. You are reducing an actual obligation, and you are building the habit of directing income surplus toward owned assets rather than expanded consumption. Both are valuable. The second is more valuable in the long run because it changes the pattern rather than just addressing one instance of it. Do not try to do all your obligations simultaneously. One at a time, focused, complete, then move to the next. The concentration of effort on a single target produces faster results than the same effort spread across multiple targets, and the faster results reinforce the behavior more reliably than the slow, diffuse kind. Here is what this entire message is actually about, stated in its simplest form. I was trying to protect a specific thing for ordinary people, not wealth in the abstract, not prosperity in the political speech sense. I was trying to protect the condition that I believe is the foundation of genuine freedom, the condition of a man who does not have to keep earning at a specific level in order to maintain the life he has already built. The man whose house is paid for, whose tools are his, whose basic life requires maintenance but not constant income replacement to sustain. That condition, ordinary ownership at the level of the basic assets of a working life, is what the dream I was building was aimed at. It is not flashy. It does not look like what people imagine when they hear the phrase American dream. but it is the specific thing that the phrase was supposed to mean before it was expanded into something that required a higher income than most people would ever earn, and that was sold on credit to the people who believed in it most. Sincerely. The version of the dream that was sold on credit is not freedom. It is the opposite. It is the condition of a man who must keep running, must keep earning, must keep managing the obligations, or lose the very things the obligations are paying for. The running feels like success from the outside because the things being paid for are visible and the obligations are not. The house looks the same whether it is paid for or heavily mortgaged. The car looks the same whether it is owned outright or 3 years into a 5-year payment plan. But the man inside the two situations is in a different position, genuinely different. And the difference matters most when something changes. The dream I was building toward was the owned version. The dream that got sold in its place was the financed version. Both look like the dream. Only one of them is. Let me close with the 3 most practical things to take from this message. The first is the ownership inventory. Do it this week. Know what percentage of the things that constitute your life you outright own, what you are making payments toward owning, and what you are renting or subscribing to with no accumulating ownership. Know your resilience profile accurately. You cannot manage what you have not measured. The second is the obligation reduction plan. Choose one obligation, the most vulnerability-reducing one. Find 3 specific things to reduce from current spending. Apply the freed amount to accelerating the payoff of that obligation for 90 days. Then evaluate. This one concrete action, done consistently for 90 days, will show you more about how financial resilience actually builds than any amount of reading or listening. The third is a permanent mental shift about what prosperity actually means. Prosperity is not the ability to make the payments. Prosperity is not the monthly comfort of living in things you are still paying for. Prosperity is the accumulation of things you own that produce stability and resilience regardless of what the income does. The shift is from measuring your financial health by what you can currently afford to pay monthly to measuring it by what you own outright and what you owe. Own more, owe less. Every month, in every financial decision, move one step toward that direction. The dream I built was a dream of ordinary people owning ordinary things outright, living in paid-for houses, driving paid-for vehicles, working with paid-for tools, building toward that condition in each specific generation so that the next one started from a stronger foundation. That dream is still available. It is slower than the financed version. It is less impressive looking while you are building it. And when you get there, when you reach the position where the basic structure of your life does not depend on next month's income to remain intact, you will understand what the word freedom actually means in its most practical and most important sense. Not freedom from work, freedom from the specific kind of pressure that the man who owes never fully escapes and the man who owns never has to face. Listen to this tomorrow and the day after. Come back to it when you are making a financial decision and you cannot tell the difference between building something real and financing the appearance of it. The distinction described in this message will tell you which side of the line you are on. Subscribe and keep going. I want to stay on the mechanism for a moment longer because it was more deliberately constructed than most people realize, and understanding its deliberate construction changes how you see it when it appears in your own daily life. Before installment credit became normalized, the language around borrowing was honest. A man who owed money for something was said to be in debt. The word debt carried weight. It implied an obligation, a constraint, a condition that a prudent man wanted to resolve as quickly as possible. Debt was temporary and uncomfortable by design. You went into it reluctantly, you managed it carefully, and you got out of it as fast as your income permitted. The language that replaced it was constructed specifically to remove that weight. Installment, plan, easy payments. These are words from which the word debt is entirely absent. The obligation is described as a plan, which sounds like something you made deliberately and wisely. The payment is described as easy, which sounds like something you barely notice. The process of spending money you have not yet earned on something you do not yet own is described as investment in your quality of life. Every one of these language choices is designed to produce a specific psychological response in the person receiving them. The response is comfort. The message is, this is normal, this is fine, this is what wise and responsible adults do when they want good things for their families. The discomfort that the word debt would have produced, the urgency to resolve the obligation quickly, is replaced by the comfort of a plan, which implies that everything is already accounted for and under control. I am not saying that everyone who used this language was consciously manipulating. Many of them genuinely believed that installment credit was a good tool that helped ordinary people access things that improved their lives. And it does help people access things. That part is true. What is also true is that the language was constructed to minimize resistance to the tool rather than to inform people accurately about what it cost them over its full term. The accurate language for an installment purchase is this: I am committing a portion of my future income for a defined period to a payment that must be made, regardless of what my circumstances are at the time each payment comes due. In exchange for that commitment, I receive the use of this item now rather than when I have saved the full price of it. That is the honest description. It contains the accurate costs and the accurate benefit. The language of plans and easy payments contains the benefit and omits the costs. And what you do not clearly see, you cannot accurately evaluate. I want to describe something specific that happened in the years after the $5 day that complicates the story I have been telling and that I think is the most honest version of the full picture. When I paid $5 a day and watched wages rise across American industry in the years that followed, I expected the rising income to produce the specific outcome I described earlier: more saving, more outright ownership, a broad foundation of financially stable working-class households. What actually happened was more complicated. Some workers did save. Some built toward homeownership and accumulated paid-for assets in a way that produced genuine resilience. But a significant portion of the rising income went into exactly the commercial channels I have been describing. The new purchasing power was absorbed by the expanding installment credit market almost as fast as it was created. Men who had previously been unable to participate in the credit economy because they lacked the income to service monthly payments now had enough income to make payments. And the commercial apparatus that had been waiting for exactly that threshold to be reached moved immediately to convert the new income into new monthly obligations. This was not what I intended. I intended the income to produce owned assets. What it partly produced was financed assets, which created the conditions I described: prosperity in appearance, fragility in structure. Men with higher incomes, who were, in their monthly financial behavior, nearly as obligated as they had been at lower incomes, but with nicer things to show for it. I say this not to suggest the $5 day was wrong. The workers received real benefit from the higher wages, and I stand by the decision. What I should have understood more clearly at the time was that the benefit of a wage increase is not automatic. It depends on what the person receiving the increase does with the difference. And in the absence of a clear alternative message about what to do with the difference, the most available message, the message from the commercial culture surrounding those workers, was the message of the installment plan. Buy now, pay over time. The thing is yours today. The lesson for anyone receiving a raise or an increase in income of any kind is this: the raise does not automatically improve your financial position. It creates the possibility of improving your financial position. What actually determines whether your position improves is whether the increase in income produces an increase in owned assets or simply an increase in financed ones. This distinction, made consciously at the moment the income increases, is the entire difference between the dream and the financed appearance of it. I have described what the alternative looks like in structural terms. I want to get more specific about the daily habit that actually produces it, because the structural description is useful, but the habit is what changes behavior. The habit is simple. Every time money arrives, before you decide what to do with any of it, you decide what percentage of it goes somewhere it cannot be immediately spent. Not invested in a complicated way that requires expertise you do not have. Saved, Set aside. Put in a place where it will be there when you need it for a purchase you are building toward. The specific percentage is less important than the consistency. 5% saved consistently for 10 years produces more genuine financial resilience than 30% saved for 6 months and then abandoned. The compounding of the habit over time is what produces the result, not the size of any individual contribution to it. The saved amount does not sit in a savings account indefinitely. It builds toward a specific target. One specific item that, when purchased outright, will eliminate an ongoing obligation or provide a tool that increases your productive capacity. The target keeps the saving purposeful. Purposeful saving is sustained much more reliably than general saving because the brain is much better at sustaining behavior aimed at a specific visible goal than behavior aimed at an abstract concept like financial security. You set the target before you start saving for it. You write down the full price of the thing. You write down the monthly amount you are setting aside. You calculate the number of months to the target. You write the date on the calendar. And you do not change the plan until the target is reached. This is not exciting. It does not produce the immediate dopamine reward that the installment plan produces, which lets you have the thing today. It produces the specific satisfaction of owning something real when you reach the target, and the permanent elimination of the monthly obligation that the financed version would have required. Both are real rewards. One arrives faster, the other lasts longer, and compounds into everything that follows it.